I think I'm going to move to the next slide because I think we can start doing the accessibility statement right now as we wait for some folks to come in.
Sure. All right, so my name is Jen Rowe. I will call this meeting of the Boston Region MPO's TIP Process Engagement and Readiness Committee to order today. I'll read the notice of discrimination. You're invited to participate in our transportation process regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. Next, we have a few guidelines for this meeting. All participants will join with muted microphones, and we ask that everyone rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After that, we do a roll call. Board members may also mute and unmute themselves, but always remain muted unless you're actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, you can use the raise hand function. You can find this under the participants button at the bottom of the screen. A window will pop up with the raised hand button at the bottom, or in the reactions button in the toolbar. I, as the chair, will then call on participants. If you're on your phone, you can use the *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, Logan Casey is here. You can contact Logan via the chat box at lcasey@ctps.org or at 857-702-3706. All right. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in the meeting, please contact Ethan Lapointe from MPO staff. Or actually, I think it probably Logan Casey. Logan's email is lcasey@ctps.org or 857-702-3706. So I'm sure Ethan would be also willing to help out. All right. I think we should first do a roll call of attendees at the meeting. I believe Logan is prepared to kind of conduct that roll call.
So I think we can begin. I'll be able to help on that front.
Oh, okay. So you'd like to, or I can, would you like me to call roll, Ethan?
Yeah, Jen, if you could call roll, I'll keep track of who's in attendance. I apologize.
Got it. Oh, no worries at all. Let me pull up who is. All right. So MassDOT chair one, or sorry, MassDOT seat one.
I think that's me, Derek Cravat here from MassDOT Office of Transportation Planning.
Thanks, Derek. MassDOT seat two. No one, perhaps not.
I don't think I see John Bouchard here. Logan's internet went out, by the way, as well.
Oh, so shoot.
He'll be back in a bit.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you for the heads up about that. Okay. Let's see, MAPC.
Good afternoon, Eric Barassa with MAPC.
Thanks, Eric. Town of Arlington.
Good afternoon, John Alessi with the Town of Arlington.
Hey, John, thank you. The Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Higgins Advisory Council here. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Metro West Regional Collaborative.
Dennis Giambetti, Metro West Region.
Thanks, Dennis. Minuteman Advisory Council on Interlocal Coordination.
Kristen Guichard, representing Jim Snyder, Grant Select Board member from the town of Acton.
Thanks, Kristen. And then Town of Brookline.
Good afternoon, Erin Chute, representing Town of Brookline.
Thanks, Erin. And last but not least, Inner Core Committee.
Good afternoon, everybody. Brad Rawson, representing Intercore Committee.
Fantastic, thank you. In the interest of time, I think we won't go around and introduce others, but later on, I know Ethan is willing to kind of take questions as he goes through the presentation. So when if folks besides those official members wish to speak, you may do so then, and I'll call on you. And when you do so, if you could just share your name and affiliation, that'd be helpful. Awesome. Well, at that point, I will turn this over to Ethan to kick us off.
All right, thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ethan Point, Transportation Improvement Program Manager. I wanted to start before the 3 presentations that I have today on various topics for, once again, thanking you all for being present here and also providing some context as to the topics that will be at hand. This first item is the microtransit project update, which we'll be discussing for around 40 minutes. I'm hoping that about half of that will actually be discussion oriented. And the reason why this topic has come up is due to an amendment that will be presented at next week's MPO board meeting on December 21st to discuss a scope change for a currently funded MPO shuttle project. Next week as well, there will also be a presentation on the full TIP project universe for the federal fiscal years 25 to 29 TIP, which will also include the full table and project list there, as will be posted on Tuesday. And in tandem with that, I thought it would be a good idea to provide an update, even though applications are still open for the TIP, on how the project design pilot specifically is going in terms of interest relative to the resources available, and to start talking a little bit early on scenario objectives. The universe and the design pilot presentations are also closely related there, so we can kind of blend those 2 discussions together. So moving along to the microtransit projects update, I think the just to kind of provide an introduction and orient on what today's objective is. As I mentioned, this is meant to be a lead-in and a deeper dive on the reason for an amendment that will be taking place next Thursday and a request for a release for public comment. I'll also provide some background information on how microtransit pilot projects have come into existence within the Community Connections program at the MPO, highlight some consistent challenges, not only for the MPO funded programs, but also microtransit projects writ large, and open the floor up to discussion on how the strategy of the program should move forward. So to provide some background on the microtransit pilot, this is part of the MPO's Community Connections program, the primary objective of which is to provide first and last mile connectivity throughout the Boston region MPO and its member communities there. The project types also, in addition to microtransit, include bike share, bicycle parking and lanes, and also wayfinding signage, but microtransit operating pilots are also available on a 3-year period. This Community Connections program began several years ago with the federal fiscal years 21 to 25 TIP and has used somewhere between $2 million to $2.5 million per year set aside. The funding that is used for this program is congestion mitigation and air quality funding, which is federal funding specifically meant to deliver an air quality improvement through carbon emissions reduction, which is important to our discussion here today. Microtransit, in terms of providing first and last mile connections, especially in areas that have transit gaps, has long been a popular solution, especially in areas as well where fixed route transit services may also not provide the best kind of support. In addition to the MPO's Community Connections program, there have been other state grant sources and also federal grants, like the community transit grants offered through MassDOT, which utilize federal funds for quite some time. In addition to the MPO's Community Connections program, other MPO-funded pilot programs have also been around before this, including in the early 2010s, and others have existed for some decades. The latest iteration of the Community Connections program's microtransit pilot grants actually built upon an existing workforce transportation grant program from federal fiscal years 2020. That's important because a lot of the data that went into determining those shuttles was pre-COVID data, even though many of these first awards came during the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course altered the way that demand for these services has kind of been realized. Again, I will make these slides available after this presentation because there's a lot of information here for folks that may want to digest it, but there are 7 services at their core that the MPO is currently providing shuttle funding for across multiple line items. This includes the Royal Street Fixed Route Shuttle in Canton, an on-demand service for the Cape Ann Transportation Authority that is currently only funded in federal fiscal year 25 and was previously in 23, 2 line items for Noon in Motion and in Newton, which is the subject of today's conversation. The Montechusett RTA has an on-demand service. Metro West Regional Transit Authority has 2 line items for on-demand service for Catch Connect, a fixed route service in Stoneham, and a fixed route service in Watertown for the Pleasant Street Shuttle, which is currently in operation. I'll go into more detail on each of those shuttles later to kind of talk about the broader programmatic challenges. But for now, I'd like to focus on the, core issue at hand with Amendment 3 to the Federal Fiscal Years 24-28 TIP. And that is NUMO's Noon in Motion shuttle. The NUMO shuttle began in the Federal Fiscal Years 21 to 25 TIP, which was initially funded in Federal Fiscal Years 21 and 2, with an expansion period funded in Fiscal 23. I'll have a figure on a later slide that helps to visualize that a little bit easier. To date, the MPO has committed almost approximately $1.6 million in funding over 5 years between Fiscal 21 and Fiscal 25 and those 2 project line items. The service operates weekdays between 7 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. and 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. on weekends, which also gives it generally longer operating hours than many of the shuttles and other kinds of microtransit services that are typically funded by the state. This is indicative generally of the level of performance that NUMO has achieved during its service period. Similarly, one of the other advantages of the NUMO program has been that it operates similar to a taxi service and also utilizes electric vehicles with some hybrid vehicles as well mixed in there. The advantage there being, going back to that air quality benefit, that each of the operations that NUMO takes is generally done with a clean source of energy to provide that trip and therefore prove an air quality benefit versus a single occupancy vehicle. The target for Newton was at 6,000 monthly trips, and until recently, they were actually surpassing that figure, one of the few shuttles to do so. This graphic on screen here illustrates the level of ridership that the entire NUMO shuttle operated under in Federal Fiscal Year 23. Unfortunately, I had transitions on this, but it appears they may have broke during the file conversion. But that first green box on the left between May of 2023 and August 2023 illustrates an initial decline in ridership. The reason for that actually was the breadth that NUMO tended to offer for service, initially providing service to all forms of individuals who may want to use it, including not only workforce, but also students at their public school system, in addition to seniors and persons with disabilities. When school let out, the demand for the service went down. However, one of the key changes is in August of 2023, which is when, due to financial constraints, the city of Newton was forced to, hem in the available users of their program and restrict it to prioritize a very limited group of individuals on the workforce and student side to prioritize trips for seniors and persons with disabilities. And this, as this graphic illustrates, had a clear impact on ridership reductions, going from a peak of nearly 8,000 monthly passenger trips down to around 3,750 in September. As mentioned previously, this slide and graphic illustrates the funding breakout of MPO contributions between Federal Fiscal Years 2021 and 2025 and helps to indicate why this scope change happened. The total annual cost to operate the NUMO service has generally been anywhere from about $1.2 million to $1.1 million per year, based on the data we had available at MPO staff. In Federal Fiscal Year 23, as in last year, the MPO was contributing a combined $570,000 to support the service. One of the objectives of a microtransit pilot is that the MPO's funding contributions over time will scale back in order to ensure that in the absence of MPO funding, these shuttles would be able to be self-sustaining with a combination of local funding or other forms and sources of, like, say, grant funding for operations. With that scale back of $570,000 down to $270,000, the scope change became necessary due to those more limited resources. Again, technically, the same types of individuals are still able to utilize the service, but there has been a strong market shift to prioritize those seniors and persons with disabilities to ensure that their trips can still be met for the demand response service, whereas previously it was more open access. In addition, there will still be some service area expansion, which was the focus of that second line item the MPO funded them for in the Federal Fiscal Year 23 program. and will still operate at the same hours, but the level of expansion is far more conservative than initially pitched, especially on the workforce transportation side of things for commuters. One of the items being that to look further at kind of the ridership levels, Numa was a highly popular service, and it still is, given its current level of operation. It has a high rate of customer satisfaction, and it was functionally equivalent to a $4 Uber or Lyft, given that that was the fare charge to customers. Moreover, there were also programs in place where people that may have signed up recently for the service could have also gotten free rides. However, as a demand response service using smaller scale vehicles, the service model didn't necessarily lend itself to scalability. So when demand increased, the number of vehicles that had to be in use and therefore the operating costs also increased in tandem. This slide here takes the ridership figures that I showed on the previous slide and then compares that to the cost per passenger trip, shown in light blue at the very bottom of the graph on the right for the MPO funded contributions, and in dark blue for the all-in cost per passenger trip, and the costs per unique rider in dark orange for the all-in costs, and the MPO's share of those costs shown in the yellow figure. As these graphs illustrate, despite the fact that there were increases initially between October 2022 and March 23 in ridership, there was actually no benefit in terms of capturing economies of scale despite that market increase in ridership. In fact, the amount of cost per passenger trip borne by the MPO, while relatively low compared to other microtransit services being funded by the MPO, was never actually really lowered past that amount of approximately $15 to $20 per passenger trip. Moreover, when the service began to scale back and limit the types of individuals who may be able to access the service, the cost per unique rider also skyrocketed, beginning in the summer with the closure of schools and also increasing further in September with the formal scope change by the city. For the impact of what this project needs to be altered for in the fiscal 24-28 tip, basically the necessity for this amendment, the scope that Newton applied for NUMO has changed significantly, especially given that it is a demand response service. A demand response service's offerings are substantially different when the types of individuals who may have that demand changes. As mentioned previously, this is no longer as robust. It is still a strong performing project, but no longer as strongly performing for those who may be operating for workforce commuting or for those connections for students. Again, some workforce commuters and students can still utilize this service. It is moving more towards a needs-based style of programming. And again, back in last March, there was ridership performance per month around 8,000 monthly rides or monthly passenger trips, averaging around 6,000. September, it was down to 3,750. The impact against this performance is clear, and the MPO's financial contribution remains the same. So, as mentioned, the next steps really are that at the December 21st MPO meeting next week, there will be an amendment that will solely include the scope change for Noon in Motion for consideration for release for a 21-day public comment period, given this alteration. I should mention that this scope change is already in effect by the city due to the necessities of limited resources. This decision focuses on the MPO's funding contribution to that program. While the service will continue, MPO funding for federal fiscal year 2024 is subject to this amendment. So with that in mind, I'd also like to contextualize some of the challenges that Newton has faced here, in addition to the broader MPO program and also microtransit projects writ large. NUMO to date has been the highest performing microtransit service that the MPO has funded, specifically in terms of the number of passenger trips and overall level of MPO subsidy per passenger trip. It also had indicated the greatest likelihood of continuation after the pilot's conclusion, not only in that fourth year when the MPO was continuing to fund it under the expansion period, but even in the 5th and 6th years once the totality of MPO funding had waned. Newton's challenge to continue to meet its targets despite that strong level of performance and ridership also is illustrative of a broader structural issue, not only with microtransit, but how microtransit projects are funded, not only in the kinds of federal funding used, but also the fact that the MPO is not the sole contributor. Things like local funds and other grant sources are also in play. Moreover, again, Newton was one of the higher performing shuttles, and these challenges are far more pronounced in the other MPO funded shuttles. And it's also not unique to Eastern Massachusetts either, and not in recent years alone. Microtransit projects in general, and part of the reason why they may have been initially pitched for the community connections, have often been proposed as a more modern or tech-savvy approach to address decades-long first and last mile gaps for transit operators, including in recent years through transportation network management companies or TNCs like Uber or Lyft. Many of the headlines that you might see online with regard to microtransit, including one of these publications by Bloomberg here, would state something like, for example, microtransit programs provide service that is on demand for all, or it has broad appeal and clear setbacks here, or rather, in this case, challenges. However, usually the subheaders, especially in recent years, even post-COVID, when we're seeing alterations in transit demand for workforces, have underscored the fact that it is difficult to run a transit service that is both meeting the needs of consumers, but not to the extent that they become a victim of their own success. Many microtransit services struggle in terms of meeting scalability, as their costs may continue to increase without ever realizing any kinds of benefits for meeting their demand and achieving that level of ridership. And again, I will provide these slides afterwards where I have linked to the articles that are mentioned here from Bloomberg City Lab in 2022 and also governing.com. There are also many other articles available with both positive outcomes for microtransit projects and also similar concerns with regard to the sustainability of these services. Moreover, even before COVID, certain transit advocacy groups have also raised some questions as to whether or not microtransit was truly a silver bullet for those last mile transit connections. I am not going to read all this text on the slide here, but the point of this being that both of these pieces from 2019 for the Human Transit blog from Jarrett Walker and the Transit Center blog had both sort of warned, even before COVID, that microtransit may not necessarily be well suited to the higher ridership levels of service. In essence, it is more of a Goldilocks level of service where it cannot be so low that it is not fiscally sustainable, nor so high where a better, more scalable kind of transit service like a fixed route bus would be more suitable. In this case, Numo, in a way, was one of those situations where the level of demand was so high that it became overextended and more of a, for lack of a better way of putting it, a victim of its success. The MPO's microtransit projects, as I illustrated previously, impact multiple federal fiscal years of the Community Connections Program. I've illustrated every line item on screen here for the currently funded MPO Community Connections shuttles, not only in the federal fiscal years 24 to 26 band, but to also add some context as to federal fiscal year 23. Rather than run through each of these, though, that bottom line on the Community Connections Program balance is important. One of the other realities of funding microtransit shuttle projects is that, as I mentioned at the very start of this presentation, there are other last mile connection activities that the MPO funds in the Community Connections Program. Moreover, these shuttles are temporary 3-year pilots. Of the $2.5 million that is allocated for all activities within Community Connections, the shuttles alone in federal fiscal year 2025 have already drawn against approximately $1.6 million of that year. What this meant in the federal fiscal year 24 application round, so last year's community connection round, there was only $600,000 available to fund new community connections projects last year. This year, due to a more conservative approach in funding new shuttle applications, federal fiscal year 25 still has $910,000 left to fund those new community connections projects. What this basically means is that these microtransit shuttles not only present a near-term financial obligation, but a continuing financial obligation that must be checked in order to make sure that other kinds of micromobility services can still be supported by the MPO. One of the other challenges really for service, microtransit service in the Boston region is basic economics in the sense of demand and supply here. Starting off on the demand side and looking at existing transit services. The reality is that there is very limited paratransit resources from regional transit authorities and the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority at the periphery of MPO regions. Paratransit services are often stretched very thin. Moreover, historically, microtransit and also flex route bus service has been used as a substitution for those lower ridership fixed route services that may also have higher costs. However, there's also the question being, why were those resources for paratransit and fixed route services being cut back initially. Generally, what that meant was that there was a low amount of existing ridership in order for there to be a long-term transit solution in those areas. Almost each municipality in the Boston region has expressed interest in some capacity in some kind of microtransit level of service, but that real challenge there has been obtaining the funding and making it last past those 3 years. Ensuring that it can last requires a better understanding of what post-COVID mobility trends actually look like. On the supply side as well, one of the advantages has been that microtransit services have been abundantly studied and planned for, not only with an abundance of previous pilot programs, and as I alluded to or showed earlier, plenty of media coverage, but each municipality is different. And when local services are subject to local context, a region-wide study may not necessarily be well equipped to provide the level of specificity to determine if a service is eligible. Even then as well, a microtransit service may have been operated 10 or 20 years ago and may not have been able to demonstrate success, but many may ask, could this time be different in terms of trying once again? There's also the fact that not only is there fiscal constraint within the MPO's Community Connections program, but there's also those federal funding requirements, which are legal obligations there as well for the air quality benefits, namely, and an opportunity cost. The reality is that $1.6 million of shuttle funding may not have as distinctive a benefit had it been applied to other sources of potential, or I should say, other potential uses of that federal CMAQ funding. So on screen here, I've provided some color coding on all MPO-funded Community Connections projects. As I mentioned earlier, the situation that NUMO is currently facing is not nearly as pronounced as those that many other MPO-funded shuttles are. The Canton Royal Street Shuttle project is currently in its final year of operation and is very much struggling to not only meet key performance metrics, but also demonstrate progress towards those metrics. The Cape Ann Transportation Authority's on-demand microtransit service expansion project, just the expansion, was unable to actually be expanded in federal fiscal years 23 and 4, and the project was recently defunded in federal fiscal year 24 due to limited staff capacity at the authority. The Montechusett RTA's microtransit service was funded in fiscal 23, but is still under procurement with anticipated operations commencing in December. However, this is a high-cost shuttle and does not operate in a thickly settled urban area. It is operating at the periphery of the Magic subregion, mostly in communities such as Boxborough, Bolton, and Stowe. So far, the most successful microtransit shuttle programs we have offered have been the Metro West Regional Transit Authority's Catch Connect Microtransit Service Expansion Project and the Extended Hours in Framingham, in addition to NUMO here. These have demonstrated improvements in the ridership levels that each of these microtransit shuttles have witnessed, especially in recent months. And even with NUMO's current difficulties on the resource side of things, they are still demonstrating the ability to meet the kinds of services that they had initially pitched to their most vulnerable populations. The last two microtransit services on screen here, the Stoneham Shuttle service, are still in procurement despite being funded last year, and Watertown's Pleasant Street Shuttle has indicated some low ridership and a relatively high cost per unique rider as well there.
Ethan, real quick, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. I noticed Nicole has hand up. Just wanted to see if that was in connection with the slide.
Oh, no, I do have some comments at the end. Ethan's doing a fantastic job, and I had a little more nuance to some of his points, but keep going, Ethan. Great job.
Okay, thank you.
So these are just kind of some wrap up and closing thoughts slides before we actually move into discussion, because I want to have a discussion here. So what I want to recognize here is that this isn't just about the Boston region MPO staff, but also MassDOT and the municipalities that are pushing for these projects. There's been a significant amount of financial and staff resources invested in these microtransit projects. The MPO's contributions to microtransit shuttles are often a fraction of the overall cost that it actually takes to operate these services. However, as that previous slide illustrated, around 25% or fewer of projects that have been funded by the MPO in this area have actually demonstrated any potential to continue after their third year. And as illustrated, a potential to continue is not necessarily a guarantee of long-term success if other funders or other forces come into play that restrict resources to continue microtransit operations. And also, many pilot programs that are using these as a data gathering or potential exercise are a pretty expensive lesson to learn relative to other kinds of opportunities to study these services further or plan there. What I'm effectively arguing here as the tip manager to the staff to the Boston Region MPO is that the current trajectory of this microtransit program is not indicating that it is sustainable. Ergo, if it were to continue on its current course, the program may cease to exist. That is, however, not what we are trying to do here, I think, in the sense where 3-year microtransit pilot projects, we hope that they may still be applied for. Even since the inception, regional transit authorities have also had a preference in the scoring process, though now even more so because they demonstrate the ability to maybe more accurately gauge demand for ridership, given their greater staff resources, given that they have certain other metrics and other experience operating transportation services. We're also further emphasizing the role of technical assistance from our partners at MassDOT, the Volpe Center, for example, and also at CTPS as well, and are hoping that we can use this opportunity to maybe explore other ways to also deliver climate and mobility benefits with CMAQ resources. And then I just have some supporting data here that I'm not going to go through just in case it comes up during discussion. But with that, I open the floor to questions on that front. So Nicole, I'm happy to jump back a couple slides if you want me to.
No, wonderful. I'll just say a few things. First off, thank you for the presentation and thank you for supporting microtransit and supporting the Newton program. I have to say, from our perspective, this has been a fantastic pilot to really understand not just transportation in Newton, but understand a new technology. And I think we and the entire MPO's microtransit projects are really, delivering data that's important for the entire country. And we're really, setting a trend in terms and figuring out how this works. From our perspective, we've had incredibly rich data. The number one thing that we know is there is, even in a city like Newton that has relatively high car ownership rates, a really high demand for affordable, reliable transportation that gets you where you want to go. And what we learned is a vast majority of our ridership are quite low income relative to the rest of Newton and relative to any scale. So we are finding people that really need transportation. And when we read the letters from people, asking for code so they can use the system to qualify as low income, they are very clear that this is, life-changing for them. But in a couple things to point out there, in Newton, here we are as this pilot, and I think we have so much more to go in terms of thinking through how to make this sustainable. So one of the things we're doing is on the cost side, looking at what we can reduce. So we actually are receiving bids back now for our next iteration of the program. So it was the end of our 3-year contract with VIA, and keeping it as competitive as possible, reaching out to different types of vendors, still keeping microtransit and ride share. Other things that we'd love to explore is the price levers. What is the right price to charge? So in our last iteration, we did raise the price for general users up to $4 from $2. And there was just not much data, but should the price be $6? Should it be $8? What happens when you get much above Uber and Lyft? Are people still going to be using it because this is known drivers? It's a lot safer. It's a homegrown program. And can we generate some real revenue that we can put back into the system? So those are another levels that we want in addition to the price. The third is an operational level. Right now, we are trying to provide almost concierge level service for our seniors. This is doubling as our, senior transportation system in the city of Newton. And we were trying to capture economies of scale, which we've done for that program by providing general service. So there's some things that have sort of brought our utilization rate down. That's the number of trips per vehicle per hour. Bringing the utilization rate down is directly related to the cost per trip. So some things that we have is seniors can pre-schedule trips. Any pre-scheduled trip adds in an inefficiency. For the seniors, at times we've actually blocked off a certain number of vehicles at certain peak hours so that the seniors get priority. We have a high level of customer service for them. So a lot of decision making that actually brings down our utilization. And it was really interesting. There actually are economies of scale to the system, but some of them were a little bit hidden. So we launched the system actually in 2019 just for seniors. And that was it was pre-COVID, and then we hit COVID. And what we saw during COVID is the number of trips that we could do per hour actually was quite high because there was no traffic. COVID ended, and then the system, we were able to grow it to where you saw it at 8,000 trips. And in that period, traffic was picking up a little bit, but you still saw the economies of scale go up. So we were able to deliver a high level of service at about 3.3 trips per service hour. As we've gone down in number of trips, and as we have increased the level of service for the seniors by making it more concierge, you've actually seen the trips per service hour going down. But that's based on decisions. But we really did see the cost per trip get down to $16 a trip or less, which for, and that's the gross cost, which for, a public transit system in the suburbs is approaching good. The other thing that we learned is we have been using mostly sedans, except for waves. And the reason we're doing that is we can use electric vehicles and be sustainable and have essentially no carbon emissions. And we looked at, is that killing our utilization rate? Is that increasing the cost per trip? Could we actually get 6, 7, 8 people in these vehicles if we changed it? And the data was showing that the answer is actually no. So we can see how many times you have one person in a vehicle, 2, 3, or 4. And the number of times that we were at capacity was such a tiny fraction of the times. We realized that going up to vans was not really going to increase any efficiency in the system or optimize it anymore, but we would lose all of the sort of sustainability benefits of being electric vehicles. And so that is actually what that indicates, is in a city that doesn't have a real strong grid system, and it doesn't have strong commute pattern desire lines for this type of system, you're not going to see 4, 5, 6, 7 people going in the same place at the same time. So there were no economies of scale from that. Anyway, so I want to say we are optimistic. We are looking at making any of these changes so that we can bring it back as soon as possible to a full citywide system again. We are going to be applying for one more MassDOT grant, the one that's come out recently, the Transportation Innovation Grant. And I will say there is, no matter what, still always this gap, which is this is public transportation. Public transportation, whether it's the MBTA, RTAs, etc., are never financially self-sufficient without some level of government funding. We still are working to, bring in businesses to get money, and we've been successful to some degree with that. We're looking at price levers in terms of the fares we charge. We can look at operational changes, and we can look at vendor pricing. But I think it is hard to see a future where no government funding is included. We do, as a city, put in $275,000 of city funding, $30,000 of formula funding already towards the system. And we will always continue to do that. So that's all I want to say, just some clarifying points. But and again, thank you for supporting this project. I think it's been a really important project to learn so much about microtransit. To me, there is a huge success in having a new transportation system that is delivering a really high volume of trips and has the potential for even more.
Great. I saw Lynn Diggins.
Thank you. I apologize for the background sound here, so hopefully you can hear me. Ethan, how do we calculate the benefit? Within maybe the scope of CMAQ or whatever source of fundings, and then across all our other metrics that we use for the other programs in the TIP.
So at a baseline minimum for all projects in the Community Connections program, they need to demonstrate benefits to air quality across 3 key areas, which in this case, NUMO has accomplished. These are reductions in CO2, which is measured in kilograms, volatile organic compounds, and nitrous oxide. Some MPO-funded shuttles may struggle to meet those thresholds, and that is a legally required threshold to continue operations using these federal funding. The other measure is the rough cost per passenger trip. This is treated as an approximate analog to determining whether or not the shuttle would be able to operate in the absence of MPO funding. It could still seek other kinds of federal or state funding for their operations, but these are at heart pilot programs where using CMAQ funding, the MPO can't provide this level of funding past 3 years, which is to say, we generally want to see an improvement in, or rather a reduction in the cost per passenger trip, not only incurred by the MPO, but also that which is incurred by the project proponent themselves there over time. And then we also look at the cost per unique rider as well, which is
I'm sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, Ethan, because I'm looking at benefits, not costs. So I want to find out how we calculate the benefits, not only, like I said, within the program, but also across our other goals, and metrics in the tip. Essentially what I'm trying to find out is like what can we say are the benefits that are provided, to the riders, other users of the system?
So we try to track customer service, satisfaction rates. When it comes to reauthorization of funding that is considered, may not necessarily be heavily weighted. We are actually using the Conveyal study that is currently underway right now at CTPS to better measure out transportation equity benefits as well, given that we often rely on customer survey data to that effect, mode shift, which is also generally assessed through customer surveys. We want to get a little bit more quantitative on that front, though, instead of our typically qualitative approach. Also, the quantitative approach allows us to provide the word is eluding me here, a consistent level of evaluation between each MPO-funded shuttle. One of the struggles would be that if I went back to that slide previously that showed all 9 of those different line items that the MPO is funding, very few of those line items are comparable to one another. So we also kind of struggle to benchmark not only what success is, but what a challenge may be as well.
Thank you. And by the word, the word is ergo, which I appreciated your use of. Thank you.
Thanks. Josh, your hand up.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you so much, Ethan. Great presentation and really helpful to see the a service that I work on every day to put in the context of a regional, comparable services across the region. I would just add that one of the other sources of funding that we are diligent about is mitigation funding from developments. Newton has a lot of multifamily mixed-use housing, and wherever we can leverage the TDM funding to support operations, we do so. It's not usually recurring. It tends to be just for the first few years after a CO is granted a certificate of occupancy or building permits. But that is something we try to do. And I just mentioned this because I know that a lot of us look at housing and transportation as being closely related. And from a strategic standpoint, Newton is seeking to ensure that, particularly as we reduce parking requirements, that we are providing good transportation alternatives to new residents of these developments, and to the extent that we're able to get them into a citywide microtransit rather than have a dedicated shuttle, certainly preferable to having single occupancy vehicles on the road. That's something else we try to do. I don't know how that can directly translate to the benefits that Len is asking about. So on that, I would say, and Nicole could probably speak more about this, we do regular customer satisfaction research. And if there is a way to harmonize what we ask or ask additional questions that might be comparable to what other systems are asking, perhaps we could do that as well. The last thing I'd say is I did not see Salem in there, and that may be because they aren't receiving funding, but it would be interesting to put them alongside, not just because they're operated by VIA, the same as us, but that there may be some learning that would be a benefit to the MPO as well. And I'm also happy to answer any questions and really have appreciated the support. And then finally, just a shout out to Nicole, the godmother of Newell. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. Great. I want to pause a little bit and see if anyone else has give folks a time if they have any additional questions. One question I might have for Ethan is a lot of what you shared here was the kind of comparing the different services to one another. I was curious how we might do a kind of comparison with kind of the cost benefit analysis between these type of micro transit operations to the other items that can be funded in community connections. I know like for kind of as a rough napkin calculation, kind of per trip cost for blue bikes is something like $2 to $4 per trip. But I was curious if there might be other ways of kind of getting at the opportunity costs that you brought up.
So I'll also say that this isn't the last time we're going to be talking about a specific shuttle here. We haven't chosen to single out Newton for any reason besides the scope change. We'll be continuing to have these discussions as other shuttles look to authorize fiscal 24 funding. And as we do so, that is going to be more rigorously considered. One of the things that is happening in addition to the microtransit portion of Community Connections is the Community Connections program writ large. With the advent of the Transit Transformation Program, certain investment types like transit signal priority that used to be accounted in Community Connections are now gone, which has opened up the opportunity to try to explore other kinds of investment types, including things like the return of wayfinding signage this year, other kinds of navigational aids, and other, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, new micromobility activities that are eligible for federal funding. That also includes expanding our bicycle rack and bicycle lane programs to try to figure out better ways of actually getting those implemented, given demand to date has often been kind of low there. So we're hoping that this spring and into the summer, that we can start trying to reevaluate the program and look at a wider breadth of different funding opportunities that this all could be used for. I would also just like to flag real quick as well. We do have a couple other topics, but I'm happy to still answer a couple questions.
Thanks, Ethan. I see Nicole has.
Oh, yeah. One thing I always think of on cost per trip, with most of the microtransit systems, when we talk about a cost per trip of $16, that's all in, which would include capital costs and the cost of the vehicle. So when you're doing it apples to apples, like with the blue bikes, and you factor in that there's probably 20 million of capital spent behind it, it probably evens out a little bit more. Interestingly, when we do like cost per trip on blue bikes in a suburb like Newton, you're in double-digit numbers for something like that as well. So I think you need to look at capital versus operating, the fact that they're combined, and then also just land use and the density.
Great points. Thanks, Nicole. Yeah. Definitely much more to dig in. Thank you so much for both you and Josh kind of being here and then bringing your additional kind of context and expertise in the matter. So really appreciate it. And I will, Ethan, hand it back to you. I think we might be ready for the next agenda topic. Not the first or last time we'll talk about this as this committee probably and the MPO as a whole.
Right. I'd also like to talk, so for my next two presentations, I'm actually going to consolidate the discussion portion into the very end about another action item, or not really an action item, but item that will be going before the board at next week's MPO board meeting on December 21st. And this is the TIP project universe. For this part of my presentation, just provide an overview. I'll be reviewing at a high level what the contents of the fiscal 24 to 28 TIP were, the rough project development process in terms of how does a project get into the universe and eventually on the TIP, summarize what the TIP universe looks like that will be shown next week, which will be posted in time for next Tuesday in full, and also describe some next steps as far as what this document means, how it has changed, and what programming scenarios may look like. Then after this presentation, I will jump into an update on the project design pilot, which is very closely woven into this presentation. So to just provide a very brief review of the federal fiscal years 24 to 28 TIP, Boston Region MPO and the 12 other MPOs in the Commonwealth, in addition to MassDOT, update their transportation improvement programs each year. In the federal fiscal year 24-28 TIP that was developed in the last cycle, there was $50.2 million that was distributed to 21 new projects. 10 of those 21 were in the Community Connections Program, which is a fairly small portion of MPO funding, and 3 were in the Transit Transformation Program, meaning that they were transit projects within the MBTA. This was also compared to 23 new projects for the fiscal 23-27 cycle, which was up from the total number of projects actually funded in the 22-26 round. These were new projects only, however. The TIP itself in the Regional Target Funding Program alone accounts for 58 total projects, which are programmed against a total funding availability of around $700 million. Some of that funding is held in reserve for things like contingency as well. In addition, the fiscal 24-28 TIP also implemented new investment types of programs, such as the Bike Share Support Program and a dedicated design pilot in federal fiscal year 25 to help improve the project application pipeline. Why does that pipeline need to be improved? As I think I've mentioned in other meetings of this committee and other MPO board meetings, there has been a longer-term downward trend in the total number of applications that the MPO has received. This graph illustrates how in the 2019 to 23 TIP cycle, there were around 25 projects scored by MPO staff, so projects applied for. In 2020 to 24, that number was relatively similar, around 24 projects. And in the same year that the Community Connections program was implemented, not necessarily that this was an impacting factor as the downward trend really was COVID, that number began to decrease dramatically down to around 17 projects in the core investment programs in 21-25, 14 in 22-26, around 12 in 23-27, and most recently only around 7 projects in 24-28. So this has been a very significant decline in a relatively short period of time for TIP development. The smaller dollar value programs in the overall TIP, namely the Community Connections Program, have still been performing well in the total number of overall projects received over time, but they do represent an increasingly prominent portion of our investment programs, despite the fact that they still have that relatively small dollar value. To kind of help to explain why there may be a decrease in the total number of projects that we're seeing for the core investment programs, bike ped, intersection improvements, complete streets, etc., there's the project life cycle. Every project the MPO may fund often goes through a parallel life cycle or a complementary life cycle with the MassDOT funding process as well. All projects start at generally the same point or the same stage, I should say. A conversation with a MassDOT Highway District member or a conversation with MPO staff will generally direct a project proponent to the same outcome, that being the one that is on the left-hand side of the screen, which is project initiation, that second stage here. Once a project is done with initiation with MassDOT, which goes through the Massachusetts Project Intake Tool and is reviewed by Highway District staff, it then goes through a scoping process. That defines the general limits of the work or the total overall cost. There is then, as the next stage, the scoping process, the Project Review Committee approval stage. I'll go into each detail on the next slide as to why these are important, but Project Review Committee approval is really the main gate to get through in order to seek federal funding. It is also the much earliest point at which a project could be evaluated with TIP criteria or to start trying to formally seek federal funding. One of the key thresholds for TIP funding tends to vary depending on the kind of project that we're actually talking about here. There's 3 main ones that are of concern when it comes to the TIP universe of projects. This being the initiation or scoping phase, this being really the earliest stage at which a project can be realized. This may outline a general conceptual scope of work or something more specific for the Project Review Committee to consider. This is the earliest stage at which a project may consider application for the project design pilot. As mentioned previously, project review committee approval, which is a stage at which a project is considered by MassDOT's engineers in their various sections, such as right-of-way or utilities, is still a fairly early stage, but it does give that go-ahead to start working for federal funding. It is that earliest stage at which a project may apply for construction funding, including in the regional target programs at the MPO. However, 25% design, which generally refers to when a project has obtained key design elements with a relatively fixed scope, there may be some changes on the periphery or other appurtenances, and certain permits are complete, is where a project becomes a superior candidate for consideration for MPO funding versus ones that may not be at 25%. The greater the design threshold, the better. So to provide an overview of the 2025 to 29 universe of projects, the TIP universe really begins with the 24-28 universe presented last November as a baseline. Staff then subtract the projects that were selected to be programmed for funding, the ones that those 21 in the 24-28 TIP, and any projects that were deactivated. A deactivated project does not mean a canceled project that has been tabled, but rather a project that was in the TIP universe that has not had any action on it or momentum on it for several years. That does not mean that the project can never come back, but just that it is not currently a priority for either MassDOT or perhaps the MPO. Furthermore, that project list that the universe then tracks is refined, incorporating any correspondence with municipal TIP contacts, virtual meetings with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council sub-regional outreach entities, and also feedback from MassDOT's highway district offices who may be able to keep a better, closer eye on what kinds of local projects are actually going through initiation and review committee. So this table on screen here shows the highest level summary of the TIP universe of projects. The item that is most prominent here is that far left column being the total projects in the universe. There are 143 projects in the TIP universe of projects. There is one key difference to this list versus last year's, and that is the addition of the Community Connections program as a field and investment program for consideration in the universe. With that said, however, even at 143 projects, this is a very significant increase from what was seen last year. Last year increased from around 90 projects in 23-27 to 105. This being, I believe, around 38 projects added in there. This is a significant jump. The reason for that predominantly is because the formal threshold to be considered into the universe has been altered. There is less gatekeeping for listing in the TIP universe of projects. Previously, a project may need to be at that project review committee stage or pre-PRC, pre-review committee stage, in order to be actually formally incorporated into the TIP for funding. This has been representative of a higher interest in advancing projects for that 143 level, because in addition to construction projects, we're also seeing more of those design pilot projects as well that are before initiation. The universe is a way that MPO staff and MPO members and other stakeholders may want to track projects that are going to be seeking federal funding, and therefore we're also tracking the ones that are just starting their journeys. As I will get to, because I'm about to do a by sub-region breakdown, this is important because the universe also gives us the ability to assess at that sub-regional level how certain clusters of communities are doing compared to others. And generally speaking, having 143 projects in the universe this year compared to 105 last year isn't a bad thing. A growing universe means that we are seeing a growing body of projects with which we can evaluate where different bottlenecks in the project pipeline are emerging. So starting off with the inner core projects, the inner core increased from 37 projects in the universe last year to a new 46 projects there. One of the recurring trends when it comes to inner core projects is that almost all inner core projects have achieved project initiation and project review committee approval for most of these. The Bicycle and Pedestrian Network program is the greatest driver among these communities in terms of that overall jump of about 9 projects there, with communities being Arlington, Belmont, Boston, Brookline, Cambridge, Milton, and Newton, all having new projects, all of which have obtained MassDOT approvals to seek those higher levels of funding. That said, these also include projects that may have federal earmarks on them and already have some funding assigned, such as the Mystic River, Mystic to Minuteman connection in Arlington, or the Beacon Street Bridle Path in Brookline. In addition, we also have other projects that may be advanced by other state actors, such as the Department of Conservation and Recreation. The project shown on the top right of the screen is the Boston Milton Osceola Street Bridge Path, which is a DCR project that MassDOT is supporting, but is also in the MPO's universe, just because it is a local and regional priority. For the other subregions, I'm kind of going in order here as far as those that have been performing quite well in terms of recent universe developments compared to ones that may be less engaged with it. We have the Minuteman Advisory Group and adjacent Metro West Regional Council. Both of these subregions have increased from 7 projects each in the 23-27 cycle to a 15 in Magic and a 10 in Metro West. The other really positive thing that has come out of this recent cycle of engagement at the MPO has been that there is more distributed interest and engagement. What do I mean by distributed? Multiple municipalities are expressing interest in multiple different kinds of projects. So it's not just 1 or 2 municipalities having 5 different projects. It is each municipality comes to the MPO and says, we want to improve this intersection, or another wants to do a bike trail, or another wants to do a complete street. There's also been a very strong interest from these communities in the project design pilot in particular, as they are trying to get more engaged with the TIP process. And moreover, the Community Connections program, which has, in terms of the non-micro transit projects, often been explored predominantly in their inner core, are being more seriously considered out here as well. We're also thinking that given the transit transformation program's advent, this is also going to be a key area for growth of that transit transformation program and projects included in there. Next up, we have 2 subregions that have historically performed well when it comes to getting projects on the TIP and through initiation. This is the North Suburban Planning Council and the North Shore Task Force. The northern suburbs have added 2 more projects from 8 to 10 to their list, and the North Shore from 13 to 18. As mentioned, these communities have historically been very well engaged with the TIP process, and they see steady progress on the design side and in project initiation. These communities historically are also able to get their projects funded by the Regional Target Program and bring them to construction. When we do the Appendix D regional distribution of TIP target funding with each TIP cycle, the North Suburban Planning Council and North Shore Task Force tend to receive a level of regional target funding that is greater than their proportion of population in the MPO regions, and that is because they are pretty well engaged and familiar with these priorities. Moreover, they're also well acclimated with new trends and other kinds of funding programs at the federal discretionary level, including increasing priorities and most of these new projects being added, focusing on some level of vulnerable user safety, either in the form of an intersection improvement project or more design work to be done for connected multi-use trails, such as the Border to Boston Trail or the Harmony Grove Path in Peabody and Salem. To move on to some subregions where we would like to see a little bit more distributed growth in their figures, the Southwest Advisory Planning Group, or SWAP, has actually seen a very strong increase from 16 to 23 projects, and the Three Rivers Interlocal Council have increased from 11 to 14. Most of the growth in these areas have been in complete streets projects, which is good given that many of these communities have not had an MPO-funded project in quite some time. However, of that net growth or net increase of about 10 projects combined, only 4 communities are actually accounting for all of those new projects. The main barrier there being that getting projects initiated and designed is their greatest challenge. Those 4 communities, just to state them, are Sherburne, Rentham, Milton, and Canton, which have been very well engaged. It's getting the other communities in those areas actually integrated in. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that the community of Bellingham, which is also in the SWAP region, had unsuccessfully applied for a project in the 23-27 TIP cycle. Bellingham had not had a project in the TIP for about 15 years at that point. So we are also still tracking existing projects that may be considered for funding coming out of these subregions as well. And lastly, we have the South Shore Coalition. This is the subregion that probably has the most challenges with it. This is an increase from 6 to 7 projects. That one new project was Hull's Nantasket Avenue redesign project, which is still seeking a source to design and eventually construct. Engagement with communities on the South Shore has been tricky, and CTPS staff are currently working with our partners at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council to try to see how we can capitalize on recent comprehensive planning and trails planning at that MAPC has done to move more projects along there. There are major gaps when it comes to regional trails and also vulnerable user safety there. And of course, the dominant issue being resilience concerns for roadway networks in that area, despite the lack of activity that we're seeing. So as I mentioned at the top of this, I would like to jump on to the next topic, which is the design pilot, and then I will open the floor for discussion. If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand as I go. I'm happy to kind of answer, but to move into what the design pilot is, I'd like to mention how we can look at those communities that may not be well engaged and how this design pilot was meant to reverse that trend on lower application trends. So starting off, the MPO's project design pilot was funded with $4 million in federal fiscal year 2025. However, only $3.2 million of that four can actually be awarded to municipalities. The $800,000 difference there is the local match that communities will be expected to contribute, which counts against the regional target balance of the MPO, given that the target balance is a combination of federal funding and the match that is necessary to support it. The award is currently for federal fiscal year 25 only in terms of that set aside, though there may be some flexibility there depending on funding availability come scenario development. It is also only eligible for new design work only, given that federal funding can only be used for new design procurements. And this design pilot can fund any level of design work for those communities. Any contracts that are awarded through the project design pilot would be held by MassDOT, but municipalities would still be involved in the request for proposals process and would be reimbursed for expenses. The bottom line being, the municipalities can still pick their own consultant even if they are funded with MPO dollars and still move through the project development process as they otherwise would have. What we are seeing so far in the applications that MPO staff have obtained, I should also mention that the application period is still open, which is why I do not have a list of these projects, and many of these applications are still works in progress, is a very high volume of projects for dedicated bike and ped infrastructure. A lot of these are off-road trails and paths, I should mention, so not necessarily on-road shared use paths. These, again, are mostly rail trails, but we're also seeing some short-range connections, like construction of new pedestrian facilities, for example, over certain barriers like highways or rail lines. We are also positively seeing intersection safety projects being pushed further as well. Something that I did not mention in that previous presentation on the universe was that no intersection improvement projects were applied for that were initiated in the last TIP cycle. So being able to sustain that level of investment in targeted safety improvements, especially with the MPO's Safe Streets and Roads for All Regional Vision Zero action plan, is very important. The Complete Streets program is still a lagging area. We have seen applications for that, but it is very much outsized by those bike and ped projects and intersection safety projects. With that said, the bottom line is we are seeing very strong interest here, and that is a double-edged sword. For one, this validates what many of your communities have been saying for months and years, really, that there is more demand for state and federal support to design projects to get them on the tip. And this level of demand we're seeing for the pilot means that there should be sufficient demand for future years of funding in this program. However, the fact that there is so much demand against that $3.2 million means that there is insufficient resources to support all applications for funding. Again, there's about $3.2 million to distribute thus far, with about around 2 to 3 weeks left to apply for projects. There's around $5 to $6 million in request right now for the design alone. So one of the ways that board members may be asked to address that sort of deficiency in funding, once we learn more about what the funding levels are available from the ARPA meeting in January, and eventually the outcomes of the TIP project readiness days, is something that is also meant to make assessing and developing project programming scenarios a little bit easier this year. And that is the compartmentalization of project scenarios. So given that several MPO programs work against a set aside amount of funding, the scenarios, rather than looking at, say, scenario 1 versus scenario 2, which accounts for changes to all 58 projects in the TIP, would be compartmentalized so that new projects would only be considered against their set aside level. Therefore, there would be a design pilot bundle 1, 2, and 3 that each operate against that $4 million bucket. The idea here being that the design selection process would only look at that 4 million and therefore would not necessarily need to be considered in the context of a much broader array of projects that could make discussion and synthesis of the overall scenario more difficult. The final programming scenario, if there's additional federal funding available in fiscal 25, 6, 7, or 8, even for future years, would then be factored in once community connections, transit transformation, and the design pilot, and of course, the outer year core programs, fiscal 29, for the construction projects are finally considered. The point of this compartmentalization is just meant to be so that given all of the new investment program types and other discussions, that assessing scenarios can take place with reduced confusion. However, we are fallible in terms of my ability to assess how much I will confuse somebody with that compartmentalization. So we'll see how it works. But really, one of the priorities for the design pilot and that set aside there is that some areas and types of projects will be emphasized more heavily across these scenarios than in previous years. Last year, the 2 core scenarios looked at how much a project scored on the aggregate and how much that score was relative to the amount of funding asked for. There will be more performance areas considered, but we're also looking from input from communities and, of course, board members as well to determine what those performance measures may be, not only how they're consistent with our goals and objectives, but other factors as well. One example being municipalities that do not necessarily have a history of getting projects on the tip in the past 10 or 20 years, whether or not they should be considered first, or also how that lack of experience with getting a project on the tip may compare or may inject risk versus communities that have the staff capacity to administer this design funding. So, for example, a community that has one planner on staff that may be fairly stretched thin and that they do transportation and housing, even if they were given an award, may not necessarily be as likely to actually realize the funding for the design pilot versus a fully staffed one. Again, this is not necessarily a prescription, but more something to consider as we develop the scenarios. And we are asking applicants to not only mention how long it has been since they've had a TIP project, but also what their staff capacity is to administer the funding as well, just as we do with the Community Connections program. So with that, I know that was a lot of information between the universe and the design pilot, but happy to open the floor to any questions there. And also go back if anybody wants me to repeat something.
Thank you so much for that, Ethan. That is a lot of information, and I think provides quite a extensive overview of where we are right now. I am now seeing some hands raised. I believe, Brad, you had yours up first.
Well, thanks, Jen. Thanks, Ethan. Thanks, team. I'll just be super quick and congratulatory. I want to connect the dots here to this discussion and things that the MPO board has been asking for many years. This is seeming to me to be a process improvement, a transparency improvement, the ability for us to make data-driven decisions, to administer some tricky funding questions, assess risk, and really work to promote geographical equity and socioeconomic equity in our investment packages. So I know that we're at the beginning of the process, but folks, we have a very stressful 5 months ahead of us to culminate in the new TIP. And I'm so pleased that we're hitting this milestone with today's discussion before the turn of the calendar year. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, staff.
Len.
Thank you, Jen, Madam Chair. So Ethan, this is really good. It's a lot of information, a lot of useful information. Just some comments for us to think about. I appreciate that we're asking about experience. But I hope that to the extent we see, that there's some experience, it incentivizes us to try to help out those communities. Because otherwise, you just end up in a situation where the haves get more and the have-nots get less. And I know that's obvious to everybody, but I think we just need to figure out some way to help out the communities that have less experience, because the only way they'll get more experience is if they get the projects. But I understand also if they don't have the resources, then there's not much we can do. A question for you is the limitation on our part with respect to funding simply the money? Would we, let's say we had more money, would we have the staff available to provide the technical assistance?
So if we had more funding, it's up to board members. There is the possibility to increase the amount of funding available to cover, depending on the financial requests. In addition, project design also takes more than 1 year. So there's a possibility that if a community asks for $100 million of design and the design would take 4 years, that it could be $250,000 a year. What I would caution is the exact same lesson that I think we may have learned from the Community Connections program, where a project that might need to be funded across multiple years not only may represent a long-term financial obligation that will need to be tracked closely, but also that if many projects are funded in 1 year of the tip, especially given that this is a design pilot program, it may become unwieldy for staff and board members to manage to make sure that all projects are actually on track. What we are doing here at the MPO, and I should also mention that other MPOs are also looking to take this on, is what our understanding is fairly novel, and there may be some growing pains. One of the fortunate things is that, as folks at MassDOT may be able to allude, one of the benefits has been that under the infrastructure law, we're seeing a lot of design earmarks, like the Border to Boston Trail and the Beacon Street Bridle Path, where there is actually now a framework in place to use federal funding through MassDOT for design. So again, it is really up to the board members there, but I think we need to not only balance trying to fund as many projects as possible, but also being able to manage that number of projects, not only at the local level on their staff time, but also making sure the project managers at MassDOT, folks at CTPS, and also other parties that are engaged here can make sure that these projects are on track. The other reality too, I'd just throw in is at the very start of the design pilot, there was discussion around making sure that any project that is looking for federal funding to get designed is very likely to also get funded by the MPO for construction, which means that if we choose to fund many fairly cheap design projects now, we may build up a debt in the form of many projects to build in the future. That is a good problem to have, given that we've been very short on the total number of applications we receive in a given year. But it could reach a situation where if we are faced with fiscal constraint, we have designs on the shelf that aren't getting used and designs can expire. So it's another risk to factor in.
So with respect to compartmentalization, is that only applying to the community connections, or are we thinking about applying that to all other types of projects being in the TIP?
Let me go back and kind of look at this. This is not a comprehensive list, but this will not be for all investment programs.
Okay, fine. That's it.
This would be for the design pilot, community connections, and the transit transformation set asides first.
Gotcha.
And then federal fiscal year 29, given that is a new year. The remainder of the funding would then be incorporated into the initial draft scenarios.
Gotcha.
They would all be part of the same presentations.
Okay.
It would more be that there would be board members may be selected with options of pick this one for this set aside, this one for the next set aside, sort of like putting together a puzzle. But hopefully less complicated. Again, last year, just to kind of speak to why we're doing this, with those 58 projects that changed, we wanted to make it so that in a meeting environment, when requests for amended scenarios are being made, that the total ripple effect that can emerge can be easily visualized, especially given that we have so many new project types that are coming in.
Gotcha.
I hope that makes sense.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. All set.
Yeah. Worst comes to worst, I'll also just add, if it's not going well, we'll just go back to the old way we've done it, but mostly just trying this out to make sure it's a little bit easier to navigate.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Ethan. Next, I saw Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. This is really great. So one question I have, you mentioned that for the design pilot, we're receiving a lot of requests for shared use paths and other bicycle like trail type projects. Was that correct?
Yes, a lot of these are trails. A lot of them have also been looking at mass trails funding as well for design, is my understanding.
Okay, good, because that was actually the comment I was going to make is, and I was actually just trying to see if the Mass Trails program had any updated information about, typically their grants have like, I think a February 1st deadline. And I can't remember, I feel like they fund up to $300,000. And a big reason for that program was to try to get more design money out there to kind of tee projects up for implementation and kind of move them along in the process. So I'm hopeful that, you know, folks are pursuing that program as well. And to the extent that you can provide them with information about that, I would encourage you to do that too. So that's good to hear that it does sound like people are aware of that. And then my other question is, when are you going to present on the universe of projects? What is the schedule for that?
Next week, and with that, there will be the full PDF table posted next Tuesday for
Got
review.
it. At the full MPO meeting.
Full MPO meeting, yes.
On Thursday, which I think I'll be chairing. So, okay, that's great. Looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thanks. Next, Rachel.
Hi, Rachel Benson, Director of Planning and Economic Development in Rentham on the MPO as a designee for Joe Botash, Chair of Rentham. I hope I got all that right. So I have a couple questions, and I may have gotten lost in some of the explanations as well. But on the universe of projects, just interested in what those districts and where those are very active communities, what those districts, I'm talking about Mass DOT, District 5, District 3, what's their capacity? And are we seeing, do they have, I see District 5 is all the way from, Rentham all the way down to the Cape. Are they stretched thin, and maybe District 4 is not stretched as thin, and so they are able to maybe reach out to their counterparts, local counterparts a little bit more and start that process. And then on the tip, it's on that same vein, I guess, what is the outreach to DPW directors? What does that look like? Is that an existing thing? Because those are probably typically the people that are going to be initiating a tip, I would say, a project, unless it has to do, with planning, a large project coming in. And then was very surprised to hear that Bellingham hadn't gotten one, because they've seen some pretty big developments recently. And so in those lower performing communities, I guess, for lack of a better term, what are the projects that they're even doing? It could be like Holliston, they have a huge warehouse that's going in, but we don't see a lot of development happening. We're starting to see a lot of warehouses going in our area, but again, that's just sort of changing with the times too. So that might also be why you don't see tip projects as well. That would be a interesting sort of study to go a little bit deeper in on that. And I do apologize. I probably won't be, I have to leave at 2:30, so I may miss your full explanation. I apologize, but it's being recorded, so yay me.
It's all good. Yeah, it's being recorded, and we actually, I think, may have a hard stop around 2:30, 2:40. So to keep it fairly succinct on the first question with regard to district capacity on the design side. So each of the districts has been made aware of the design pilot, but one of the important things is that, as you alluded to, Rachel, many of the districts that we work with are operating with multiple MPOs. We are quite fortunate in the Boston region that we have District 6 in the inner core, because District 6 is fully encompassed by our region, and District 6 has been very engaged, I would say, in working with municipalities and highlighting this for them. I'd also say that other districts we've worked with have done the same too. The trick, of course, is that District 4 and District 3, for example, also have other MPOs that are also considering the design pilots as well. So District 3 has also been very well engaged in trying to advance projects in Metro West and in the Magic subregions. District 4 is a very big region as well, and has also been trying to push that along. It comes down to staff capacity, and to some extent too, the fact is that our prerequisite for the design pilot is project initiation, which itself is a burden on the district staff. So it's sort of correlated where, depending on how well MPO staff are meshing and ourselves hearing back from the districts, the more projects we can get in the design pilot. They are another bottleneck because we kind of operate on that parallel process. District 5, we have heard from and notified of the design pilot process. But on that front, that is kind of a recurring thing where we're working with them and they're aware of it, but we haven't seen a lot of communities in that area making progress on the initiation side of things for a variety of reasons. With regard to the actual factors that may be at play on the construction side, I'd say that is the same factor as well for communities like Bellingham, but also Bellingham was able to get to project review committee approval and also 25% design. They were not selected in the last scenario because of fiscal constraint in fiscal 28. They are unlike many other communities in that getting their project initiated and getting design funding are their two biggest hurdles. Initiation is often that first hurdle. And while it may seem smaller, you actually have to hear back in order to move forward is kind of the trick. And then for the design cost, of course, being the other cost prohibitive factor. We are seeing a variety of different projects. The Bellingham project was a complete streets project with solid stormwater improvements, safety in their public school district areas, and other crosswalk and bike lane enhancements where there currently aren't any. That's the case for many other communities in those regions. It is just a matter of designing the projects because design is very expensive. And when using federal funds, it takes a long time. As I know you guys are more than aware in Rentham, given the number of projects that you're all trying to work on the development there too. I feel like I may have missed the third question.
That's fine. And we can talk about it, offline and my many other emails that I sent to you.
Not the only one. Thanks, Rachel. I had seen Dennis's hand up, but it was lowered, so I just wanted to check in. You had any?
Yeah, no, I'm fine. Most of my comments or thoughts were discussed. I do want to add one thing. I guess I would say something. I just want to thank Ethan. I know he's worked quite closely with a number of communities around the design pilot initiative. There's a lot of questions because it's a new program. Ethan has been quite remarkable in following up with the communities. I just want to thank him for that.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. I'd also like to thank, a lot of other folks on this call too, who have also been working with their communities on these design pilot fronts. Like I mentioned that the districts earlier, a lot of them have really been taking the initiative and bringing these to their communities, sub-regional coordinators as well at MAPC, and of course, all of our board members that are also socializing this with their member communities. I'd also like to highlight too, we have had a lot of communities come to the MPO expressing that they want to work together to do joint applications on projects for regional coordination. That is another big factor that we're hoping we can push more of with this pilot. And our scoring strategy as well for it based on that criteria will also endorse that further.
Thank you so much. Wow. And also, in addition to delivering a very helpful overview and prompting a great discussion, we are also wrapping up right on time, which is fantastic. Thank you everyone for both, I guess, on staff, for all the preparation, everyone who's participated. I will, unless I ask, I guess, for a motion to adjourn. Glenn.
I'll make that motion to adjourn to say that last comment made from Ethan was the most positive thing I've heard, period. Thank you.
I'll second the motion. It was great, good meeting. Thanks all.
Right, we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.